In December 2001, 1 year after releasing its second expansion, The Scars of Velios, Everquest released arguably its most ambitious and game-changing expansion, The Shadows of Luclin. Luclin had a lot going on, and had some very rich lore and storytelling that links back to previous zones and lore very well, and I'm going to do a deep dive into that in my next video. I was going to integrate all of this into the lore video, but I decided it was best to keep them separate so that people who don't care about this topic and are just interested in the lore deep dives don't have to sit through this part. If you were to talk to thousands of players who fell in love with Everquest in the early days and stuck with it through the years, I believe that all of them will tell you that there was a point where the game changed. And many of them will tell you that the change was for the worse. Players revere the original trilogy of Everquest, the original game and the first two expansions, Kunark and Velios. That era is seen as Everquest in its purest form before developers strayed from the vision and the game lost its soul. There is a thriving community built around that very idea in Project 1999 that exists to preserve that bubble as accurately as possible. A lot of those players will point an angry finger at the Planes of Power expansion as the point where the quality of Everquest dramatically declined, an opinion that I disagree with, by the way. But a lot of the aspects of the game that players criticize in Planes of Power got their start in the Shadows of Luclin. And if you really take a minute to sit down and look at these expansions, you'll see that, for better or worse, the game dramatically changed in December of 2001 with its release. So, what changed exactly? Well, straight away, when you log into Everquest post-Luclin, it looks like you're logging into a completely different game. The art style and direction has completely changed course. In Luclin, the game implemented a new graphics engine and revamped all of the character models. All of the new zones on the moon also utilized the new engine and the new NPC models. A lot of players really hated these models. They complained that they were bland and generic looking and didn't have the same unique character the old models had. The most startling changes were the ogre and troll races. They went from lovable balls of ugly fun to these giant-looking things. And there's just something not right about the new dwarf models. The legs are just all wrong. I don't remember if there was the same level of hate for the new character models in 2001 as there seems to be today. Personally, I really like most of them. The main thing I remember about them is looking up how to turn them off because of the lag they caused on my old computer that I'd been using to run EQ for years at that point. It may be hard to believe now, but 20 plus years ago, EQ was pretty cutting edge and graphic lag was a big problem. Solutions like staring at the ground or facing a wall during big raid encounters, turning off spell effects, and cranking the view distance way down were already common before the new fancy graphically advanced character models. These new character models, as disliked as they were, at least looked at home in the new zones in Luclin. But the rest of the game world had not been revamped with the new graphics engine, so all the old textures and NPC models remained, causing a visual disconnect between players and the old world. A human player standing beside a human NPC looked like they were from two completely different games. I personally play a lot of Dark Elf and Ixar players, and I actually really like the updated character models for both. Especially the Ixar. Look at this guy. Seriously, look at him. He's awesome. On top of these changes, the user interface has been changed from the blocky, slightly claustrophobic, yet charming in its own way original interface to a flashy new user interface that was partially transparent and could be moved around and customized, giving players a completely different look at the game they were playing. Except, that's not true, is it? Experienced players may have just called me out for being wrong there. The user interface actually changed in Velios. I would argue that the change in UI changed the way the game looked and felt far more than the character models did, and that change was made during the pure holy trinity of original EQ. So, what else changed with Luclin that broke the game? Well, despite adding 28 new zones to the game, Luclin took the first steps towards making the world feel much, much smaller. Prior to the release of Luclin, if you wanted to travel to some far-flung part of the world, You either had to run there across massive zones, or find another player to teleport you. Luclin added the Nexus to the game. The Nexus had wizard spires that teleported players to and from locations across Norath, up to the moon, and back down on a set schedule, making it easier to travel for non-teleporting classes. This is a game mechanic that would be taken to another level in the next expansion, The Planes of Power, but it was first introduced in Luclin. The wizard spires each had a Nexus scion standing in the middle, counting down to the next teleport time, and if you hailed them and said the keyword, they would give you a stone to keep in your inventory that would allow you to catch a ride. The spires could be found in North Corona, Tox Forest, Greater Feydark, the Dreadlands, and the Great Divide. The Nexus itself had 4 spires, with Tox Forest and Great Divide sharing a teleport pad. Players still had some running to do, so the Nexus didn't trivialize travel quite to the extent that the Plane of Knowledge would a year later, but it basically eliminated the need for boat travel. It also allowed for one central location that players could all teleport to and then hitch a ride to any zone that a wizard or druid could port them to. So players were still buying ports, it was just much more convenient now. Having to talk to an NPC and then stand on a teleport pad for up to 15 minutes to travel somewhere in a game may seem horribly slow by today's fast-paced gaming standards, but back in 2001, it felt like a game-changing level of convenience. And while we're talking about game-changing convenience, let's segue into the Luclin edition that literally killed one of the busiest community gathering points in early EQ and replaced it with something completely sterile and impersonal: the Bazaar. Before the days of Luclin, players gathered in the Commonlands Tunnel, East Commonlands at the time, and sold and traded gear there. A lot of players look forward to fresh TLP servers to get the tunnel trade back, and players on emulated servers like Project 1999 list it as one of the things that keep them coming back. The Bazaar took that person-to-person aspect out of selling and buying gear and replaced it with a vendor stall where you set your prices and go AFK. But isn't that better? If you handed me a bag of items to sell and gave me 2 options, either A, I could go stand in the Commonlands Tunnel, spamming my list of items and their prices over and over while keeping an active eye on the auction spam that is flying through my chat window faster than I can read it, so I know if there's someone undercutting me, while trying to politely respond to the guy offering me 2 fine steel weapons and a pearl as a trade for my FBSS. Or 2, I can set up a trader in the Bazaar and just leave it on all day while I'm at work and then collect my plat when I get home. So yeah, I'm gonna choose option 2 100% of the time. This is one of the complaints that I see about Luclin that I frankly just don't get. When I start a new TLP server, I'm counting down the days until I can go to the Bazaar for all of my buying and selling needs. But I guess, to be fair, it definitely isn't the most common complaint about Luclin, and there seems to be a lot of people who prefer the Bazaar like I do. An expansion as big and ambitious as Shadows of Luclin would not be complete without adding a new race and a new class. And of course, the new race of cat people, the Vashir, were met with some criticism. These thick, luscious, weird, human-looking cats, complete with long tails, were not necessarily hated by players as far as I can remember, but they were mostly just mocked for their slightly silly design that kind of stuck out like a sore thumb amongst the other races. They were also not something that anyone was really asking for. Everquest already had a pretty big race selection, so adding anthropomorphic cats to the list of playable races felt unnecessary. And of course, with the Vashir came the new class, the Beastlord. Beastlord was kind of a fun cross between a monk and a shaman, while not being nearly as good as either. It did bring a couple unique buffs to the table for raids, and the melee class with a pet concept is definitely cool, but in a game where there were already 14 playable classes, you have to ask, was Beastlord necessary? Did anyone really ask for this? My memory of that era of Everquest was that the Vashir and the Beastlord were seen as a kind of novelty added to the game that no one really took that seriously. It was more options for the sake of having more options. I personally didn't play a Vashir or a Beastlord until years after the release of Luclin because I didn't really care to try. I had my favorite classes already established by then, and I was focused on leveling and improving them rather than starting fresh with something new. I feel like a lot of people were in the same boat as me on that one. Luclin brought one more big change to the game, and it's the thing that I think about most when I think about that expansion. Alternate advancement levels, or AAs, allowed players to keep gaining experience after they were at max level, and earn AA levels that they could assign to different perks and abilities. This is probably the best thing added to the game throughout the years, in my opinion. It allows you to keep grinding and increasing your character's power even after hitting max level, and it gives you something to do outside of raiding and hunting for loot. I always assumed that AAs were universally liked by players because I couldn't see any reason why they wouldn't be. But when I was doing my Luclin research and reading, I did find a number of people that hate AAs. The few people I found who elaborated on their dislike of AAs seem to not like the power creep it introduces into the game or the extra grinding it requires them to do. But from my perspective, not all AAs are powerful or necessary, and I like having something to do once I reach max level. I've played other MMOs where raid logging at max level is common and it just feels boring to me. AAs also allow for each expansion to add something to the game without increasing the level cap, and I think that's a good thing. If EQ added 5 levels every expansion, everyone on live would be running around at like level 200 or something crazy like that. And no, I didn't do the math. Another big complaint I hear about Luclin is that the zones all feel so big and empty. There are cavernous dungeons with scattered mobs and open world zones that are just wide open spaces with very little in the way of geological features, buildings, or even things to kill. And as much as I do like this expansion, I have to admit, I see it. I get the issue. Some of the zones do feel empty. But you have to think about it for a minute. A lot of the dungeons are haunted remains of a long-dead empire. The cavernous look and feel to them makes them feel like there used to be these grand structures that are now abandoned. The outdoor zones in a lot of cases are a moon surface that is exposed to the vacuum of space, or desert that is eroded away into smooth rolling dunes. These zones do make sense for what they are. And to say that all of the zones feel empty and featureless just isn't true. There are zones like the Umbral Plains, Maiden Eye, Twilight Sea, or Sanctus Saru that look amazing and are full of cool things to see. Paladol Caverns is a claustrophobic maze, and Grieg's End is a cool dungeon layout. Sure, all the mobs in those zones look the same, but what are you contrasting that with from early EverQuest? Guck, where everything is a frog? Or maybe Solasec A, where everything is the same goblin model? I will always defend Luclin on this. It has some of my favorite zones, and I think it was designed with intention, and it was done very well. I just want to add one more Luclin addition to the end here, and that is mounts. I actually forget sometimes that mounts were added with Luclin, and mounts are one of the few things that I sincerely dislike in EverQuest. I like the concept. Being able to sit while casting and moving helps casters out with mana regen, and the boost in speed in outdoor zones can be great in situations where you have a long run ahead of you. But I just can't stand the way it feels to be on a mount. The movement seems off, and the way you don't actually stop when you stop pressing your movement key is terrible. On top of that, most races just look really silly sitting on a horse. So that's Luclin, the expansion where most EverQuest players will tell you the game started to change. I personally love this expansion. If I was to make a list of my favorite expansions, it would easily be top 3. It has great lore, and I think it added a lot to a game that needed to start changing and adapting to the market. See, that's the thing so many people forget about this era of EverQuest. EverQuest did not exist in a vacuum. Other game developers saw the success EQ was having and were making games of their own to compete. If EverQuest had been content to never change and just roll out the same formula they followed with Kunark and Velios, the game would have died a long time ago. A game like EverQuest has to change and grow over time to stay competitive. In the end, it didn't really matter. They were still surpassed by games like World of Warcraft that came to dominate the market. But many of us are still playing Everquest to this day, and I don't think that would be the case if it wasn't for expansions like Luclin and Plains of Power making sweeping changes to the game. Thanks for watching, and keep an eye out for my Shadows of Luclin lore video that should be coming out soon. Luclin has a lot going on lore-wise, so I've been taking my time with this one. Talk to you next time.